All right, everybody click OK. All right. Okay, so here we are, February 20th, I think, 2024, spring 24.
21st, close.
What did I say? 22nd? Okay, 21st. Okay, and I have the absolute pleasure, honor to introduce Dr. Catherine Wergin-Schweikert, which she graduated last month. Was it last month? Was it January? No, it was November? I don't remember. You're muted. But anyway, very
4th.
proud, very pleased. Catherine is also the author of The Compassion Remedy. You might want to check that out. And her dissertation was looking at correlating psychophysiological measures with measures of compassion. So I will let her share with you what her study was all about and what her findings were. And so, Catherine, if you want to share your screen, go for it.
Yeah. Okay, here we go. Let me find. I think this is the one I want to share. Let me just make sure this is the right one. You guys can see this?
Yeah.
Okay, and then I got to move myself into present mode and present. There you go.
Wonderful.
How's it look?
Beautiful. Great.
Fantastic. Okay, so I like I said, I'm Catherine. Like she said, I'm Catherine. I'm a little bit nervous. I'm not quite sure why, because I've presented this before and it's stuff that I know really well, but somehow today the nerves got me. So this study was a labor of love, and I'm super honored to be here to tell you guys about it. And I'm so excited that anybody wants to listen to it at all. So you may find that that's true when you get at the end of your dissertation, which I promise you will. And so here we go. So this is correlations of hair cortisol, long-term stress measurements, heart rate variability, compassion, self-compassion, and fear of compassion levels in healthcare workers, my people. Here we go. So this is an overview of what we're going to do today so that you guys know what's coming and like when it's going to end. If you guys, oh, look at, there's a typo right there on significance. And you'll know when it's going to end. So first we're going to talk about the problem, because when you're going into research, you got to have a problem, right? You're looking to solve some problem. Then you come up with a question to address that problem. And then when you have that question, you come up with your hypotheses. So we're going to talk about that. And then you got to figure out how you're going to study it. So we're going to talk about the methodology that I used, and then the results I got, the significance of those results, and then where somebody else can take the baton and go further with it, which is the recommendations, which is kind of one of my favorite parts. So here we go. The problem. There are actually lots of problems associated with this, but the primary problem is just really high levels of burnout in healthcare workers, and to find out how we could mitigate those. And so that was the primary problem. And the secondary problem is this burnout actually affects the quality of patient care. And that, is that the primary issue or the secondary issue? I mean, it's kind of hard to say which one is more important, if there is importance to be placed on either one. But really, the primary thing, without that burnout, the level of care would be, a little bit elevated. And so we're kind of considering these two things while we're going forth with the study. And the research question was very, very simple. Are long-term cortisol levels measured hair cortisol concentration, HCC, and heart rate variability, HRV, correlated with compassion, self-compassion, and fear of compassion? And let's find out. So our hypothesis is that a statistically significant relationship does exist between hair cortisol concentration and HRV with compassion, self-compassion, and fear of compassion. And that null hypothesis, is the opposite. It's a statistically significant relationship does not exist between these measurements. And the methodology, I smile and I think about Dr. Sherman each time I say it's mixed methods because it fits the definition because there's qualitative and quantitative measurements, but it is a very simplified mixed methods research project. So the quantitative measurements, the things that have numbers associated with them, were the hair cortisol, the HRV, the scales of compassion, self-compassion, and fear of compassion. And that one can also, those scales, actually, when I go into the study, we'll talk a little bit more about how I measured them and how I statistically analyzed them, where they could also be considered almost qualitative because there is no number associated with some of the ways that I had to measure it. And we'll talk about that. But the qualitative measurements that are there clearly are the occupation of the individual, the department in which they worked, and the race that they were. And I do want to say in HRV, the measurements were the RMSSD, the SDNN, and the natural log of high frequency, just so that you know. You'll see. Okay, so now this is where it gets really interesting. So I did the chi-squared categorical measurement, and the purpose of this test is to determine if there is a difference between the observed data and the expected data, if it's due to chance or if it's due to the relationship between the variables that we're studying. So is it due to chance, or is it just, is it random, or are they related? And in this particular study, we had to turn these numbers into categorical data. And this is how I did it, because when you're taking the compassion tests, this compassion, self-compassion, and fear of compassion test, it's not a number necessarily. And you end up with a number at the end, but what does this number mean? And so does this number of 5 mean you have high compassion, or does it mean you have low compassion? And so turning this into categorical was a little bit tricky because not all of these things had a gold standard for how you would do it in a categorical way. So with the compassion, I used a median split. And so we just got the median number of my population, and then below that median was low, and above that median was high. And with self-compassion, thank you, Kristen Neff, for already having categorical data available for the numbers that you get at the end of that. And I just used hers, which again was a median split. And then for the HRV, again, median split was used. And I also did the median split following Dr. Noonan's paper, because this person did a review of 44 studies with 21,000 people using median splits as a way to measure categorically HRV. And for the HCC, I used a median score as well. And this was following Dr. Izawa's research, is they used the same method of extraction as I did, which was the ELISA method, or as the lab that I used did. And so I figured that that was a nice way to kind of figure out how I was going to turn all of these numbers into categorical data, which is high, medium, and low, which doesn't have a number associated with it, which could be considered qualitative. You see where there's kind of a gray area in this, kind of whether this is a qualitative or quantitative measurement when we're talking about the chi-squared. So with chi-squared, it's categorical, but when I look at the other statistical methods, we are dealing with quantitative data. Does that make sense to everybody? Thumbs up, thumbs down. Sweet. I can see one person. Val, thank you for putting your thumb up. All right. And so what we found here was kind of cool. There were 46 participants in total. For the hair cortisol level, we had 4 that needed to be taken out because they were outliers. And out of those outliers, there was one that was really, really skyrocketed out. And as it turned out, this person was using testosterone cream and testosterone supplementation, which can affect your levels of cortisol to the degree that it was really unhealthy. And so this person was sent back to their physician to get worked up, to get them taken care of. And the other 3 were just random people who were using topical cortisone that they didn't tell me about it when I asked them during the process of inclusion and exclusion. Let's see here. And so for the purposes of here, the hair cortisol level had a relationship with compassion, self-compassion, and fear of compassion. As hair cortisol levels rose, so did the fears of compassion. And when hair cortisol levels dropped, the levels of compassion and self-compassion were higher, which I really enjoyed seeing that, because that was what I expected to see.
Catherine, I just want to interrupt for a second. Do you mean to be on the same screen still?
Yeah, I'm talking
okay.
right here. This is the hair cortisol levels. There are 42. Compassion,
Okay.
self-compassion, and fear of
Okay.
compassion have a relationship.
Okay, great. Okay,
Yeah.
just making sure. Okay.
Yeah. Because I don't like switching slides too much, but maybe I should switch slides a little bit more. And you guys,
No,
yeah.
don't think that way. I just
Oh,
wanted to
okay.
make sure. I wanted to make sure that you thought that if you thought that you were, progressing with your slides. Anyway, it's all good.
No. Okay, wonderful. Okay. And the HRV folks, we had 46 that made it through the gauntlet. And now with the categorical data, the RMSSD and the high frequency were associated with all three: compassion, self-compassion, and fear of compassion. However, the SDNN was not. And as we know, the RMSSD and the high frequency are more associated with vagal tone than the SDNN. The SDNN is more associated with kind of a balance between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. And so we get to see more about like self-regulation when we look at all three of them together. And so this is an interesting thing that carries on through the study, this difference between the different types of measurements of heart rate variability and how they relate to these levels and measurements of compassion. Does anybody have any questions about the chi-squared categorical primary outcome data? I don't know. I can't see the little chat, but if anybody has any questions, we can always do it at the end as well. Okay, so now I also analyzed the data using Spearman's ranked correlation. And these measures talk about the strength and direction of association between two variables. So it'll let you know how strong it is and which direction it goes. Is it a negative or a positive association? Now, interestingly here, I used it initially because my data was not, it did not have a normal curve to it. It was a non-parametric test used because my data just did not have that normal distribution. And I also want to point out in this particular test, I used the natural log because, again, the raw data didn't follow a normal distribution, and using the natural log creates a view of the numbers so you can see exponentially how that data would be related, and you can direct it right back to the derivative, which is the raw scores. And so we use the natural log of hair cortisol, the compassion scores, and the HRV. So we did use that. Again, we had 42 in the hair cortisol, and there was no relationship seen between hair cortisol levels and compassion, self-compassion, or fear of compassion in this particular analysis. And fear of compassion and self-compassion came out of this, showing that as fear of compassion rose, self-compassion decreased. And that makes sense. So I like it when data makes sense. So as somebody who was very fear of expressing compassion, they had lower levels of self-compassion. And with the HRV, it is the natural log of the SDNN that was associated with compassion and no other measurements. And this is really interesting. And I'm going to hit on this point again, because this was not seen with self-compassion or fear of compassion. It was only within the measurements of compassion that the natural log of SDNN. And remember when I told you that the measurement of, you know, the sympathetic and parasympathetic, more intervention, more sympathetic and parasympathetic interaction between the two with this particular measurement. And so it gives us, again, a better idea of the self-regulatory mechanisms within the body, and just kind of a neat thing when you think about it when we're talking about compassion. And then again, with primary outcomes, I used a jointly modeled regression that did not that took in all of the information, didn't separate and stratify. It was the jointly modeled regression, which, and again, just because I don't know where everybody's at in their course of study, I like to say why I used a test. The regression models are used to identify the association between variables, with an independent, which is the cause, and the dependent, the effect. And so in this study, we could have gone either way, really, but we made compassion measurements the cause, the independent variable, and the HRV and HCC measurements the effect. We were seeing the, you know, if these qualities of had any effect on. And so it's kind of a cool, you know, how it could have gone either way. I thought it was cool. And for the hair cortisol levels, again, no significance was seen with all the scores of compassion, self-compassion, or fear of compassion. And then with the heart rate variability, we saw that, again, compassion with the natural log of SDNN were related, and the fear of compassion was with the natural log of RMSSD and high frequency. And we know that those two are linked, and again, very vaguely mediated. So this was where, again, this starts getting really interesting for me, because this fear of compassion, now this is a state where you're stressed and tense about expressing compassion, and the natural log of the RMSSD and the natural log of the high frequency were both lower when there was a high fear of compassion. And then with high levels of compassion, we had higher levels of SDNN. So now it separates out, like, well, what's so different about compassion versus fear of compassion and RMSSD and the high frequency? And one of the things, when we define compassion, we talk about how you see somebody suffering, and there's this empathetic hit that you get. You feel like, oh gosh, they're suffering, I've got to do something. There's this sympathetic hit that you get, this empathetic, sympathetic hit that you get at the beginning of a compassionate response. And then once you're in that empathetic state, the next thing in a compassionate response is to move out of that empathy and get into the frontal lobe, get into the reward centers of your brain, and start thinking about, what can I do to alleviate their suffering? How can I decrease suffering? And so I really love this, because this shows us right here, possibly, that natural log of the SDNN, because of that sympathetic basis, their sympathetic effect in this measurement, actually shows up with compassionate kind of responses, opposed to fear of compassion, where that empathetic hit is not going to be felt, because, hey, I'm not touching that. I don't need, I don't need to feel compassion here. I'm done. And so I really think that that's like one of the greatest things that that came out of this little bit here. And I'll talk about it again. But so the significance of the primary outcomes, and we haven't gotten into post hoc yet, because I'm on my way there, but this is the first study showing long-term, and that's cortisol, plus compassion, self-compassion, and fear of compassion. There are a lot of studies out there that show short-term salivary cortisol, but this is the first study that to date, as of the time of me presenting this to you and writing my dissertation, has shown these two things being studied together. And then, here we go. And then differences in the RMSSD, the high frequency, and SDNN. Now, this is something that isn't talked about in a lot of the research when we're talking about compassion. They'll just say that heart rate variability and these measurements are affected or related to, but they don't really separate them out in this way. And I haven't seen anything I've seen some studies just using RMSSD and some studies just using SDNN. But so this for me is kind of interesting. And the third thing is that targeted interventions and long-term measurements, could be more effectively utilized given this information. And so I think that that helps out too. Because you can measure something more long-term with the hair cortisol now that we're seeing that we can when we're categorically, um, you know, look at the numbers and look at the results, we can see associations and we can dig a little bit deeper into them with the more nuanced statistical analyses that we have at our disposal. So I think it's kind of cool to kind of use both of them to get a better picture of what actually is going on. And so let me see, did I miss anything? Targeted interventions, yeah, okay. And then let's look at post hoc analysis. And so in the post hoc analysis, the things that I didn't intend on studying that came out that were really interesting is that out of the 46 participants that we had, it solidified that the BMI, people with higher BMI had lower HRV overall. So those folks right there. And then also, the age, the older groups had lower HRV, and with HCC, with the hair cortisol, no differences were seen. But people that were less than 48 years old seem to have higher self-compassion scores. And I just thought that that was kind of a cool thing, that those younger folks actually had more self-compassion than the older folks. And I just thought that was really kind of an interesting thing. And we can all speculate what that might be. And then occupation, those with higher acuity levels, like those who worked in ICUs, ERs, urgent cares, had higher fears of compassion. Now, this makes a lot of sense to me because I've worked as a PA for 23 years in emergency rooms and urgent cares. And I can tell you the culture and how we're trained is, yeah, but did you die? So it isn't one of those things like where we're trained to really connect with our patients. We're trained to not have people die. And so it's really interesting. And the culture is changing, mind you. And we are all going to be part of that change. And I just think that that was a really interesting finding there. And those that had patient contact, because there were a lot of people who didn't have patient contact because this was just healthcare workers working in a hospital. Those with patient contact had lower HRV with all three measurements. So with the RMSSD, the SDNN, and the high frequency, the natural log of high frequency. So having patient contact is bad for your heart health. But again, this kind of makes intuitive sense when you're looking at, how stressful is it to have somebody's life in your hands? It's pretty stressful. Not saying that it isn't stressful to run the machine of the hospital itself, but there's a certain level of stress that goes along with having people's lives in your hands. Another interesting finding was that the Hispanic population that I had higher levels of hair cortisol levels overall, but they also had higher compassion scores overall. And that is counterintuitive because you would think with higher compassion, you'd have higher hair cortisol levels like we saw in the categorical data. But when you stratify out and you separate out all of the possible qualities like race, the Hispanics had higher hair cortisol and higher compassion levels. And, is this a cultural thing or is it a coincidence? Is it just my low N? I don't know. But I think the most interesting thing for me was within the compassion questionnaire, there's a section on indifference. And this is supposed to be negatively affecting your compassion score. So if you score high in indifference, this means you're going to score lower in compassion overall. And so I thought about this and I thought about, you know, indifference, when we looked at these scores of indifference, people who scored higher in indifference actually had higher levels of the natural log of the SDNN. And so it was curious to me, and I kept thinking, wow, there it is again, that empathetic hit, and then you have to move into this process of like empathetic detachment. You can't stay in that empathetic place and be a compassionate person, because if you're caught up in feeling what they're feeling, if, like I always say, the difference between like compassion and empathy, if you're in an empathetic state and you see somebody drowning, well, you're basically jumping in the water with them because you're going to feel wet, scared, you might drown with them, right? And a compassionate state, you're going to throw them a lifeline, you're going to help them pull in, you're going to be a little bit detached so that you can actually do the thing that's necessary to help them out of their suffering state, right? And that's an extreme example, but extremes tend to work out well when you're trying to make a point. So in that place, there is this bit of indifference after that empathetic hit. And so I was thinking that maybe that indifference increasing your SDNN could be part again of that empathetic hit of compassion that you move out of and then move into something a little bit more helpful and useful, like a compassionate state. And so again, the significance of this post hoc analysis is I had some conflicts with gender, because in my study, gender did not come out as something like women and men didn't score differently in hair cortisol levels. They didn't score differently in HRV. Again, I only had 42 people and 46 people to get these measurements from. So maybe my N is just so low that it really didn't have a robust showing, but it confirmed BMI and age. So that was comforting, that like at least I had enough to show some of what has been seen in the past. The high acuity and fear of compassion, that was really interesting, because then that really gives us a place to do targeted interventions. Because there are interventions to help people address their fears of compassion so that they can move forward into something else. Because with that high acuity, high levels of fear of compassion, the higher levels of fear of compassion are associated with lower levels of HRV and higher levels of hair cortisol levels, right? So we don't want to see that in the people that are taking care of the most needed and sick people, right? We want those people to be as healthy as we want our patients to be when they leave our site, right? And so I think that this is really interesting, that that's a significant finding, and I think that it's worthy of additional investigation. And also, back to the indifference thing, I really am struck by the indifference, because I've always been a fan of Stoic philosophy, right? Because it just suits me. It just calms me down. The Stoics, I don't know, they had it right for me. And so I'm going to give you guys this little bit, and I'm going to read it to you, even though it's wordy, but let's do this. Let's do this together. All right. So here we go. We're going to get everybody out of the way. To live a good life, we have the potential for it if we can learn to be indifferent to what makes no difference. This is how we learn, by looking at each thing, both the parts and the whole, keeping in mind that none of them can dictate how we perceive it. They don't impose themselves on us. They hover before us, unmoving. It is we who generate the judgments, inscribing them on ourselves, and we don't have to. We could leave the page blank, and if the mark slips through, erase it instantly. And so this is really kind of the crux of this concept of this indifference, this score of indifference being higher, but it actually helping our heart. And so I think that when we think about indifference, we might really want to think about, is indifference totally bad? And there's benevolent indifference. where you have to maintain, where, you know, if we can learn to be indifferent to what makes no difference. I mean, if something isn't going to make a difference in alleviating somebody else's suffering, let's not address it. Let's move to something that will. And so I think that this is a really important thing to look at when we start thinking about compassion, is this quality of indifference. And even though historically it's been categorized as something negative, when I look at the data, it's not that negative. It's kind of interesting, something to think about. Let's see here. And so recommendations for future research, I would say, gosh, I want to repeat the study with a larger N to include more male participants, people of color, have a wider age range with more and varied occupations. I think just, you know, getting more people in would be a really, really nice thing to do. I'm going to get this out of the way. Interventional study with measurements pre and post intervention. I always love a good intervention. Consider menopause as a covariant, because we were dealing with a lot of people who were approaching that age. And I think that there aren't enough studies done on menopausal women. I think that we tend to disappear a little bit in the research. And I think so putting that in as a covariant, and hey, even I missed it when I was doing the study. So there it is. I could have put it in, but I didn't. I didn't think about it until after. And add ACEs, adverse childhood event scores, to the questionnaires, because that would be a nice, easy little bit of information in there. And I could go back to my participants and get an ACE score on all of them and reevaluate the data as well, because I did have all of my participants sign permissions for me to contact them for future research and add on different questions and see if things pop up for me. So I could go back and ask the menopausal questions in the ACEs, but we'll see, because I'm just settling in from defending my dissertation and the post-traumatic dissertation disorder. And I think that's it. Thank you guys for listening to this. Hopefully I didn't go too fast. I wanted to leave time for questions, and yeah. I don't know. What do you guys think?
I think wonderful.
Yeah. It definitely leaves a lot more questions than answers, but I like that. And I think that that's part of the goal of good research, is to make us think and do more.
Does anyone have any questions or comments for Catherine?
I have one comment.
Yeah.
You very, very clearly gave the rationale for eliminating your outliers, and it made sense. And we do not see that in the literature enough. You should feel very good about how
Thank
you
you.
defended that. So good
Yeah.
going.
Yeah, I think it's really important because, well, for me, it was, I really need to make sure that people know why these people aren't here, because I don't want to, and I know this sounds really weird, but I don't ever want to be accused of tampering with data, because when you don't tell people what happens to each and every single person in your study, there lies the question, well, did you just take the ones out that just didn't fit? Because outliers can be very important pieces of information, and we can overlook really important answers or new questions if we don't have those guys sitting in there in our study, and if we don't explain when we let them go. It's huge. Thank you, Dr. Sherman, for teaching me that, by the way. He's the one that taught me that.
I wasn't fishing for a compliment.
Oh, you don't have to. I've got all kinds of
You did it
compliments
right.
for all of you. No fishing expedition necessary. I don't know if you guys know how lucky you are, but you really have some amazing faculty here. And I'm saying that after I've graduated, so I have no ass to kiss.
Well, any other thoughts or questions? please feel free to ask Catherine, because, she's gone now. I mean, you might not find her. She'll be off into another atmosphere here.
I don't know. Yeah, I'm pretty much, I'll be around. I'm around. Dr. Sherman gave you my website, so you guys could contact me that way if questions pop up, or you could just talk to Dr. Kirsten or Dr. Sherman, and they know how to get to me. They can't get rid of me that easy.
Sounds like the mafia. We have
Right.
to keep track of you.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly,
I
exactly.
know. I know. No. And you actually do. You do actually eventually graduate. It's true. And I see Horace's name there, but I don't see Horace's face, but I'm super happy to see your name there, Horace. I don't know if he's still attending, but I see his little name right there.
Catherine, what are you planning on doing with the information?
What am I planning on doing? Well, the cool thing is that I'm doing a bunch of different things is what I'm doing. So, I actually give presentations and I work with different populations, and I do want to do some interventional stuff. Like, I want to take this information that I got from this study, and one of the things that I gave my participants for taking part in the study is the opportunity to come to a seminar that I have that helps you to uncover your own innate compassion, to remove the blocks to compassion. And so, and I also, like I said, I had them agree to, if they wanted, to have me contact them again and to repeat the study so I could do the interventional. I could use, my particular program to see if it makes a difference in their hair cortisol levels or their compassion levels. And so I can do that intervention with the people that I've already had in this study and adding to it and then just doing it again. I'd have to do 2 seminars in order to get the full picture with a bigger N. Another thing that I do, I'm presenting at the AAPB this time around. So you guys, you can hear it again. Hopefully I'll be a little more polished by then. I'm working on it. But so, and then I'm also utilizing this research to kind of say, hey, to my, my colleagues in hospitals that, hey, look at this particular department, when I looked at stuff, they have higher fears of compassion, and this is what it's affecting their health. This is how it's affecting your return on investment. So, I mean, because every person that they hire, there's an investment. And when that person leaves because they're burnt out, sick, or, having issues, then they lose a whole big chunk of money. And so, and I know this sounds really crass, but it's just the way things work. You have to show me the money. It's what people want to hear when they're talking about interventions and really trying to get in and infiltrating a system and changing it from the ground up, because that's my goal, is to change, at least plant a seed in the healthcare system so that we change the way that we treat the people who are treating the people. I mean, it's so awful. The mechanisms by which we reward physicians, PAs, and NPs when we're seeing patients, we reward them by the number of them that we see or the complexity. And so it's not great, because it puts people in a position to push themselves past normal limits. And then when we instill fears of compassion, saying, hey, you know what, when you connect with your patients too much, that's bad for you. It is not bad for you. In fact, it's good for you and even better for your patients. And the research is out there. And so I'm utilizing it in that way. And then I'm probably, I'm hemming and hawing. I got an offer to teach at a local university, Sacramento State University. And if they give me what I want, which is 50% research, 50% teaching, and the capacity to create my own course on compassion, which these things are possible, then I will likely take that job, and I'll utilize this research to further my research at the university, because they're really trying to get more researchers into that university, because UC Davis is the competing, if you will, research university, and UC Davis is much bigger into research and very, very competitive in their research. And what I found is Sac State was a little bit more collegial, and they were a little bit more supportive of a new researcher. And, you know, being 54 years old, going into a new career is scary as hell. So I want to make sure that I make the right move.
You're still young at 54.
Oh,
I'll be
and
54 this summer, so.
Allison, I love you. Thank you. That's great.
You know, it just sounds like, Catherine, it's a message that has a broad community that could receive it.
Yes,
And
I
I was
agree.
just wondering also if you were planning on maybe publishing or trying to get published in one of the nursing journals.
Well, that is very possible. And I think that if I could pick a journal, I would go for I would first direct it. Well, it's hard to say. I will go wherever people will publish me is the correct answer to that question. Whoever wants to hear the message, I will go. But if I had my choice, I would probably pick an emergency, the American Academy Emergency Physicians. That would probably be the first one I'd go to, because I had some robust findings on fears of compassion in high acuity jobs. And then internal medicine, because the internal medicine docs are usually the ones in the ICU. And because those two there would give me more leveraging power for future research. And as much as I love being a PA, nurse practitioners and nurses, we don't have,
PhD.
yeah, well, you know what? The PhD still doesn't get you what the MD gets you. So what we have to do is get that leveraging power in those publications, because once you get it in there, then you can say, hey, guess what? Look what happened over here. And then everybody's like, oh, if I go to the nursing ones first, they'll say, oh, Catherine, thank you so much. That's really sweet. And that's just the reality of it. And I don't like it, but it's true. And so I have to live in the world that I live in, because I've lived there for 23 years plus, and and my mother was a nurse, you know, so we used to kvetch about how the power plays happen in hospitals, and how you have to get through the maze. You have to just sadly still play the game a bit. Does that sound awful? I hope I don't sound too jaded.
No,
No.
you sound like you know your field.
Reality.
Yeah,
Yeah.
reality. Yeah, there's the reality. And what I really love is that the reality is that compassion actually is beneficial, and it does give you a return on your investment when you bring these compassionate qualities to people, when you allow people to express their true capacity and their true nature. It actually benefits them, it benefits the patients, it benefits the hospital. And I'll be speaking at this it's Compassion 2.0, and it's happening in San Francisco next month. Is it next? Yeah, it's next month. And I'll be speaking there, and I will be one of the people in medicine, but there are going to be people from IT, high tech. They're going to be people from, you know, banking and everywhere else. It's like all of the businesses. And it's about a grassroots way of shaking up the earth, going, hey, wait a minute, we've got this wrong. But it's a really small investment for a big change, a big return. And so I'm not alone, which is really, really nice to know, because sometimes you think you're alone when you're doing your dissertation and you're doing your things. There are people out there that want to know what you want to know. And that's important, to find those people and to connect with those people in a way that's meaningful. And don't give up, because I've had many, many, many doors slammed in my face before things started happening.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Thoughts or questions?
I just had a few thoughts there. may consider to be Horace's thoughts or comments. And my one coming from a mechanistic standpoint is the issue of the compartmentalization of cortisol in terms of the plasma levels and the levels in the hair. And I think that that should be included in future research, and another area would possibly be looking at a mechanistic model, because an issue in psychophysiology is that we lack a unifying mind-body model to explain a lot of what's happening at a mechanistic level. So that would be my comments.
Yeah. So you're saying that, because I want to make sure that I understand what you're saying, Horace, that that there should be a study with both hair cortisol and blood levels of cortisol?
Yes, because
Mhm.
I'm talking from the standpoint of chemical kinetics or pharmacokinetics in terms of the levels that you would find in different parts of the body simultaneously.
Right.
And so I think that there should be in the future some kind of mechanistic study at cell and molecular biology level, not
Right.
because I'm kind of in that kind of world, but I think that there is always the challenge to psychophysiologists. Well,
Right.
you know, what's happening at the mechanistic level
Right.
in terms of your findings.
Right. That's interesting. And it is interesting because the hair cortisol levels are very, because they're kind of, I don't, for lack of a better term, stable. Because the hair cortisol gives you like I did, 3 centimeters of hair. And so it gave me about 3 months of hair cortisol levels. So you get, it's kind of like the hemoglobin A1C of glucose readings. And so if you take that, yeah, and there are studies showing that the hair cortisol levels and the salivary cortisol levels and the blood cortisol levels all have a relationship. And if you measured the blood over and over again, or if you measured the salivary over and over again, you would get similar measurements to what's in the hair, except things like the time of day and the stress level and the this and the that that can make the hair cortisol and the not the hair cortisol, but the salivary cortisol and the blood cortisol levels go up and down, up and down, up and down. You're not going to see that in the hair cortisol because you're getting a bigger, longer picture. And so it's kind of hard. I mean, you can compare them, but you can't really compare them because you're looking, it's just like saying, like, if your hemoglobin A1C is 8, you clearly have diabetes. And if your blood sugar is 100 and, 89, yeah, you probably have diabetes, but you can't compare them in the same way that the hemoglobin A1C is telling you a story about what's going on over time, just like the hair cortisol level is giving you a story about what the cortisol levels and stress levels have been like in this human being over a period of time, smoothing out these big highs and lows by giving you this kind of, slower ride. And so I think that's interesting. I like what you're saying, Horace, and I see that it would be really I mean, we could get really specific with it and say, okay, now we're going to check everybody's blood cortisol level at 6 p.m., and it still won't give you the same information as you get with this hair cortisol. What do you got to say, Dr. Sherman? I see you.
Oh, I'm agreeing with you 100%. You gave a
Yeah.
perfect answer.
Okay.
Well, that's why they do the hair cortisol,
Right. It's just
because
stable.
that's the only way to get the story. And your analogy with the A1C versus random blood sugars is perfect.
Right.
That's
Right.
why they can't do a diagnosis with, just a bunch of blood sugars.
Right, right.
So
Yeah.
good for you. This whole presentation has been very well done.
Thank you.
You've gone into depth in answering questions. That was correct. Boy, impressive.
Woo! High five myself. Any other
Well,
questions?
yeah. Anyone else have any other questions or thoughts for Catherine?
Catherine, congratulations. That was beautiful.
Thank
So
you.
good to see you again. Congratulations to you. That was wonderful.
Thank you. Yeah.
And good luck to you.
Yeah, thank you. I'll take it. I'll take
No,
it.
it's a wonderful study, and it was something that is very valuable to me. And yeah, looking forward to chatting with you offline about it.
Yeah, cool. Well, you know how to get me.
I do. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you, Gabrielle. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, last call for questions or comments. Okay. Well, great, wonderful. Thank you, Catherine. Appreciate it very much. It was my honor to be your chair.
Oh.
And, and I look forward to seeing you around, and I look forward to seeing all of the current students around, and hopefully at AAPB, since we had a long conversation about that a little bit ago. But we are finished.
All right.
Hey, thank you all for coming.
Have a good night. Thanks.
Have a good night.
Night,
Everybody have a
everyone.
good night.
Good night, everyone.
I'm gonna call
Good
you
night,
about
everyone.
my tree.